There's a specific kind of silence that settles over a room when a man says something he cannot take back. Not the silence of surprise, not the silence of shock, the silence of everyone present deciding, all at once, whether they're going to pretend they didn't hear it. I have sat in that silence twice in my life. The first time, I was 26 years old, and my foreman told me in front of 4 other men that I didn't have a mind for engineering. He said it the way certain men say things. Not with cruelty exactly, but with a flat confidence of someone who has mistaken a long career for reliable judgment. I drove home that night, enrolled in night classes at the community college by Thursday, and spent the next 4 years earning credentials that made his opinion structurally irrelevant. I never mentioned it to him again. I didn't need to. The second time I sat in that silence, I was 61 years old, and my father-in-law stood up at his own dinner table with his good china in front of him and his companion on his right and his son on his left, and he told me, with that same flat confidence, that I had never built anything worth leaving behind. I let him finish. I let the silence do what silence does. Then I folded my napkin, set it beside my plate, drove 40 minutes home through light October traffic, walked into my kitchen, and made a pot of coffee at 10:22 at night that I had absolutely no intention of drinking. And I sat down at the kitchen table with the yellow legal pad from the second drawer on the left, and I began, very quietly, to think. My name is Gerald Pruitt. I am 63 years old. I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the same house I bought in 1994 for $127,400. I paid it off in full in March of 2011 on a Tuesday and marked the occasion by driving to bank, handing over a certified check, and stopping on the way home for a cup of coffee at a diner on Albemarle Road that has since closed. I drive a 2007 GMC Sierra with 211,000 miles on it. It has a small crack in the passenger side mirror that I have been meaning to fix for 2 years, and one of the back door seals goes soft in cold weather. But the engine is sound, and it starts every morning without complaint, which I have always considered the essential quality in both a vehicle and a person. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. The last 14 of those years I served as a principal at a mid-sized firm that designed infrastructure for municipal contracts across the Carolinas, Georgia, and parts of Virginia. Bridges, retaining systems, drainage work on highways that people drive every day without thinking about who calculated the load tolerances. I retired at 59. I did not have a party. I went to the office, signed the paperwork, shook 4 hands, and was home by 4:30. Diane had made a chicken casserole. We watched the evening news and went to bed. I want to tell you something about where I come from before I tell you the rest of this, because context matters, and I am a man who believes in building things on proper footings. I grew up in Kannapolis, North Carolina, about 30 miles northeast of Charlotte, in a house on a street with 4 other houses that all looked more or less like ours. My father, Earl Pruitt, worked at the Cannon Mills plant for 38 years. He operated machinery. He drove a 1971 Buick Skylark that he bought used in 1974 and kept until floor panels on the driver's side rusted through in 1989, at which point he bought another used car, a 1984 Ford LTD, and drove that until he retired. He wore the same 3 pairs of work pants on rotation for as long as I can remember. He pressed them himself on Sunday evenings on an ironing board he kept in the corner of the bedroom, with a focus and consistency that I think of sometimes when people talk about discipline as though it requires a grand project. He ironed his pants every Sunday. He went to work every Monday. He did that for 38 years. When he died in 2001, the church was full, not politely full. Standing room at the back, people in the vestibule, a few standing outside the side door in November cold. I stood at the back during the service and watched people I had never seen in my life cry with the particular sincerity you cannot manufacture, and I leaned over to my mother afterward and asked who most of them were. She said some were men from the plant he had helped over the years with loans he never asked to be repaid. Some were people from the neighborhood he had driven to doctor's appointments and grocery stores. One woman in the 3rd row, she said, was a girl he had tutored in math at the church's after-school program for 11 years. The girl was 34 years old by then and had 2 children and worked as a bookkeeper. She had driven 4 hours from Virginia to be there. My father had never mentioned her. Not once. I have tried every year since 2001 to be that kind of man, not because it earns you anything in the short term. It doesn't, because it is simply the correct way to live. And I knew that by the time I was 12 years old, and I have not had occasion to revise the conclusion. Diane and I met in September of 1986 at a church potluck in Gastonia. She was 24, working as an administrative coordinator at a medical practice, and she had a way of listening to you when you talked that made you feel considered rather than just heard. We dated for 11 months. We were married on a Saturday in August 1987 in a ceremony that had 83 people in attendance and cost $4,200, which Diane's mother and I split between us because Diane's father, Raymond Collier, did not come. He sent a card with a $20 bill and a note that said he had a prior commitment. I set the $20 bill on the dresser in our bedroom when we got home from the honeymoon, and it sat there for about 2 weeks before I put in an envelope and gave it to the church offering, which felt like the cleanest way to handle it. Raymond Collier had built a regional trucking company in the early 1970s. He had started with 2 leased trucks and a contract to haul textile goods across the Piedmont and had, over 20 years, expanded to a fleet of 61 vehicles operating across 6 states. In 1997, he sold a controlling interest to a logistics holding company for a number he described as 8 figures without ever specifying which part of the 8 figures he occupied. He moved into a colonial revival house in Myers Park, bought a new Lincoln Town car, started wearing cufflinks, and developed a particular manner of a man who had converted financial success into a comprehensive philosophy of life. He had opinions about everything, about real estate, about politics, about which restaurants were worth attending, and which were not, about the correct way to raise children and manage money, and conduct oneself in professional environments. He delivered these opinions at the table the way a professor delivers a lecture, with authority, with a slight expectation of note-taking, and with limited interest in counterpoint. He did not dislike me in those early years. Dislike would have required noticing me more consistently than he did. I was Diane's husband, which was a category he had processed and filed. I showed up at Christmas and Easter and sat at the far end of the table and ate whatever Patricia, his companion in later years, had helped prepare, and I did not compete for the floor. Raymond liked to hold court. I had no interest in court. This arrangement suited us both for a long time. What shifted, I think, was gradual, and had less to do with me specifically than with Raymond's increasing investment in a particular narrative about legacy and worthiness. His son Curtis had developed, over the years, a pattern of expensive failures. A restaurant in 2009 that closed 14 months after opening. A commercial real estate partnership in 2013 that had dissolved by 2015 with significant losses. A brief venture into luxury car consulting in 2017 that I will not describe in detail, except to say that it ended with a certified letter. Each time Raymond stepped in. Each time, the shortfall was absorbed and Curtis emerged intact, and Raymond wrote it off as the cost of raising an entrepreneur rather than the cost of enabling a man who had inherited his father's confidence without his father's particular aptitudes. I watched all of this from my end of the table without comment, because it was not my family's money and not my place to say anything, and also because I had learned early in my career that the most durable structures are the ones that don't require maintenance conversations. Our son Daniel was born in April of 1991. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to sound like a man who is simply a father talking about his child. I will just say this. Daniel has the kind of character that I don't believe I fully caused. He is patient in the way my father was patient. He has Diane's laugh and my stubbornness and a precision about commitments. When he says he will do a thing, that thing happens on the date specified, in the manner described that I think he arrived with rather than learned. He graduated from NC State in 2013 with a degree in civil engineering, worked at my firm for 2 years while he found his footing, and then went to work as a project manager for a construction company in Raleigh that handled mid-scale infrastructure contracts. He drove a used Honda. He lived in a rental apartment until he was 31. He did not take shortcuts. He had a clear sense of where he was going and no particular urgency to be somewhere he hadn't yet earned. Raymond's comments about Daniel were never direct. He was too socially fluent for that. They arrived sideways, inserted into conversations where they didn't quite need to be a remark at Thanksgiving about Daniel's apartment being a rental at 30, delivered as a general observation rather than a criticism. A comment the following Easter about how the men running the major construction projects in the region all seemed to have advanced degrees and certain firm affiliations, delivered to no one in particular. A question during a Christmas dinner about whether Daniel had given any thought to getting into development, since that was where the real money was, delivered with the tone of a man offering unsolicited but generous advice. Daniel absorbed all of it the same way. He nodded. He said something brief and neutral. He turned back to his food. I watched him do this across 4 or 5 years, and I recognized the gesture the way you recognize something from a mirror, and something in me went very still each time. The dinner was on a Saturday evening in September, 22 months ago. Raymond called it a family dinner, which in his usage carried a slightly elevated weight. It meant the dining room rather than the kitchen, the good china, a specific arrival time of 6 o'clock. He said he had some things he wanted to share with the family. Diane and I drove down from Charlotte together in the Sierra. Curtis and his wife Karen arrived 9 minutes after us. Patricia was already there, quiet in the way she had learned to be quiet in that house, moving between the kitchen and the dining room with the efficiency of someone who has understood, over years of observation, exactly what role she is expected to play. We sat down at 6:23. Roast chicken, green beans with almonds, rolls from a bakery on Selwyn Avenue that Raymond regarded with specific loyalty. The conversation moved where it usually moved. The weather, which had been warm for October. Curtis's new vehicle, which was a Lincoln like Raymond's but a newer model and a darker color. A detail Curtis mentioned twice. A neighbor's renovation project. Patricia's tomato plants, which had done well this year. Daniel talked for a few minutes about a bridge rehabilitation project he was managing on a creek crossing outside of Durham. The original deck was from 1967 and had developed stress fractures in the girder assemblies that required a specialized repair sequence. Raymond listened to this with the polite expression of a man who is waiting for the topic to change. After dessert, a peach cobbler Patricia had made from a recipe she said had been in her family since her grandmother's time, which was genuinely good. The best thing on the table. Raymond set his fork down. He placed both hands flat on the tablecloth in front of him, which was a gesture I had seen him use before, a settling gesture, the way a man places his hands before he says something he'd been organizing for a while. He said he had asked everyone here because he had been doing some serious thinking about the estate, and he wanted the family to hear from him directly. He said he had worked his entire life to build something of substance, and he intended to be deliberate about where it went and who would steward it. He looked down the length of the table at me. He said, "Gerald, I want to be honest with you, because I've always thought you deserve that, even when it's not comfortable. You are a decent man, and you've been good to Diane. I don't have any complaint about you as a person, but you've spent your career working for other people. You've drawn a salary. You've been comfortable, and that's fine. There's no shame in that life. But when I look at what I built and I think about where it should go, I need it to go to people who understand what it took to build it, and who have demonstrated that they can steward something of real scale. And Gerald, I don't think that's you. I want to be honest about that." He said it with the measured delivery of a man who has rehearsed it, or something close to it. Not angry, not contemptuous in his tone. The way a doctor delivers a prognosis he has already processed on behalf of the patient. A kindness in his framing. A gift, even. I looked at him for a moment. The room was doing that thing rooms do. I looked at Diane. She was looking at her plate with a stillness that I recognized as the stillness of a woman absorbing something she had not known was coming, but cannot show that she didn't know, because showing it would make it worse. I looked at Daniel. He was looking at his hands, both of them flat on the table, and his jaw had the set it gets when he is holding something in with deliberate effort. Curtis was cutting a piece of roll he did not appear to need. Karen was looking at the centerpiece. Patricia had found something to study in the middle distance. I said, "I appreciate you saying so, Raymond." That was all I said. He seemed, for just a fraction of a second, unsatisfied with this. There was a micro-adjustment in his expression. Not dramatic. Just a brief recalibration of a man who had expected either argument or visible distress and received neither. He proceeded to outline the restructuring. a trust in Curtis's name as primary beneficiary, a charitable component through a foundation he had established in 2018, a provision for Patricia. Diane would receive a modest allocation, smaller than I think she had been anticipating, though she kept her face arranged and said nothing. We stayed 40 more minutes. I had coffee I didn't want. I answered a question from Curtis about whether the Sierra was giving me any trouble, which it wasn't, and a question from Patricia about whether Charlotte had gotten much rain recently, which it had. I shook Raymond's hand at the door. I told him thank you for dinner. He said of course. Diane hugged him. We walked to the truck. We drove for about 6 minutes before she said she was sorry. I said she had nothing to be sorry for. She said she didn't know he was going to do that. I told her I believed her. We drove the rest of the way home in a quiet that had some weight to it, but wasn't hostile. When we got to the house, I told her I was going to sit up for a while. She nodded and went to bed. I went to the kitchen. I looked at the clock. 10:22. I made a pot of coffee. I sat down at the table with the legal pad, and I wrote 3 words at the top of the page. What is true? I want to be honest with you about something. There was a version of that night where I let Raymond's words do what contempt is designed to do, which is make the target smaller in their own estimation. I felt that pull. I will not pretend I didn't. I sat with it for probably 4 minutes, which is longer than I usually allow for that kind of thing, and then I set aside the way you set down a tool that isn't right for the job, and I turned to the page, and I began to think clearly. What was true was this. Raymond Collier had seen my life from the outside and drawn a conclusion that was accurate in its surface observation and wrong in almost every important structural dimension. I had, in fact, worked within organizations that bore other names for most of my career. That part was correct. What Raymond did not know, because I had never mentioned it to him, because it had never come up at a dinner table, because I do not discuss my financial architecture with people simply because I am related to them, was the rest of it. In 2001, my firm's managing partners offered me a choice between a salary increase of 14% and a minority equity stake in a firm structured through a personal LLC. I spent 3 weeks consulting with a CPA named Margaret Hollis, who operated out an office on Sardis Road and had been doing tax and investment work for 30 years and had the specific quality I value most in a financial advisor, which is that she told me things I want to hear with complete equanimity and saved me money every time she did. Margaret walked me through the equity structure in detail, including the tax implications, the vesting schedule, the liquidity scenarios, and the risk profile. She told me the equity stake was the correct choice. She was right. I formed Pruitt Structural Consulting, LLC, in March of 2003. It existed on paper for years before it mattered in any significant way. When the firm was acquired in partial transaction by a larger regional engineering group in 2016, my stake was valued and converted. I will not give you the specific number because it is not the point of the story, but I will tell you that it exceeded anything Raymond Collier had imagined was sitting across from him at his dinner table. In 2008, at Margaret's recommendation, I established a second LLC through which I purchased 3 residential rental properties in the University City corridor of Charlotte. The market in 2008 was, as you may recall, not in a celebratory mood, which meant that properties that had been valued at one number were available at a considerably different number, and I had the liquidity to act on that, and Margaret had the sense to tell me to act on it, and I did. Those 3 properties had, as of that September dinner, appreciated substantially, and they generated a monthly net income one would describe only as comfortable, by which I mean Diane could stop working tomorrow, and nothing would change in any meaningful way in how we live. I had also established in 2009 a revocable living trust through an estate attorney named Calvin Briggs, whose office is on Providence Road in an unremarkable building with a small parking lot and a waiting room with 2 chairs and a lamp and a framed photograph of the Blue Ridge Parkway on the wall. Calvin drives a Ford Focus. He has been doing estate law for 37 years. He has a habit of clicking his pen 3 times before he writes something down, which I have come to understand means he has arrived at a conclusion and is documenting it. I trust his judgment more than I trust most people's certainty. Raymond Collier did not know about any of this. Diane knew the broad outlines. Daniel knew more, because I had been deliberately transparent with him for the past several years, partly because I believe in preparing the people you love, and partly because I wanted to understand concretely, in numbers and documents rather than in abstractions, that a man can build something significant without announcing it. I sat at that kitchen table until 1:47 in the morning. The coffee went cold twice. I made a decision at some point around midnight, not an emotional decision, and not a reactive one. The kind that doesn't need to be reconsidered because it was built on the right foundation from the start. The decision was not about Raymond. Raymond was 68 years old and had organized his understanding of the world around a set of measurements I did not share. The decision was about something more specific and more important, whether the people who mattered most to me fully understood what had been built on their behalf. And the answer, sitting there at that table, was no, not with enough clarity, not with enough documentation. That was the one thing the entire evening had actually revealed that was worth acting on, and it was entirely within my control. I called Calvin Briggs at 8:14 the following morning. His assistant, Rosa Mejia, who has been with him for 11 years and who knows more about estate law in practical terms than most associates half her age, put me through in under 5 minutes. Calvin said good morning. I said I needed to come in. He said he had a slot at 10:30. I said that would work. I drove to his office in Sierra, parked in the side lot, walked in at 10:27. Rosa brought coffee. Calvin came out at 10:29 and shook my hand and closed the door to his office. I told him what had happened. I gave him the facts in sequence without editorializing. The dinner, the specific language Raymond had used, who was present, the terms of the restructuring as described. Calvin listened with the stillness he always has, pen on the legal pad, but not yet moving. When I finished, he set the pen down and said, "What do you want to accomplish?" I told him 3 things. First, a full current review of my estate documents against the actual asset structure as of that morning. I knew they were substantially current, but I wanted fresh eyes running a specific checklist against the LLC holdings, the properties, and the trust. I wanted to know if anything had drifted out of alignment. Second, a dedicated educational trust for Daniel, structured to allow him to draw on the principal for qualifying purposes: housing purchase, business capitalization, or further education, with Diane as co-trustee and Calvin's firm as successor trustee. I wanted it clean, I wanted it documented, and I wanted Daniel to know about it explicitly and in specific numbers before the end of the calendar year. Third, a scholarship fund in my father's name at the community college in Kannapolis, where he had taken a night class in accounting in 1971. My father had mentioned that class to me a handful of times over the years, not with sentimentality, with a specific appreciation, the way a craftsman talks about a tool that worked. He said the instructor, a man named Howard Bench, had explained compound interest in a way that made it feel usable rather than theoretical. I had looked Howard Bench up once, years ago, and confirmed that he had taught at that college for 22 years before retiring in 1989 and dying of a stroke in 2004. He had probably taught several thousand people in that time. He almost certainly did not remember my father's name. My father remembered his until the end. Calvin clicked his pen 3 times, wrote something, looked up, said, "That's 3 documents." I said, "That's right." He said the educational trust structure was straightforward, and he had done similar instruments many times. The scholarship fund would require coordination with the college's foundation office, and he would reach out to them directly to understand the instrument they required. The document review would take the least time. He thought he could have drafts ready in 10 business days, possibly less. Then he paused and said one more thing. He said, "Gerald, does Diane have a complete current picture? Not the outlines, the actual numbers and structure." I said she knew the broad outlines. He said, "Bring her in, not for legal reasons. She should know what she's sitting on." I said I agreed. We shook hands at 11:44. I drove home. Diane was at the kitchen counter with a cup of tea, standing in the particular way she stands when she has been waiting without wanting to appear to be waiting. I told her to sit down. She sat. I went to the study and retrieved the relevant files from a cabinet: the trust schedule, the LLC documentation, the property records, the most recent quarterly statement from the investment account, and I brought them to the kitchen table, and I spent the next 43 minutes going through them with her, document by document, number by number, the way I should have done years earlier and hadn't because I had operated under the assumption that a man building something quietly did not need to narrate it in progress. She was quiet through most of it, the particular kind of quiet that is not absence of reaction but containment of it. At one point she said my name. Just my name, nothing after it. I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you?" I said, "I didn't think it needed to be said out loud. I think I was wrong about that part." She looked at the documents for a moment. Then she looked at me and said, "He doesn't know any of this." I said, "No." She said, "Are you going to tell him?" I said, "No." She looked at me for a long moment in the quiet of the kitchen, and then she nodded, and I understood from the nod that she understood the full architecture of the decision, and we did not discuss it further. The documents were ready 16 business days after my meeting with Calvin, 2 days longer than he estimated, which Rosa explained was due to a specific instrument preference the college foundation required that took one additional exchange to resolve. I went in on a Tuesday morning in November at 9 o'clock exactly. Rosa had coffee ready. Calvin walked me through all 3 documents with the same measure of precision he brings to everything. I read each one in full. I asked 4 questions, 2 about the trust instrument and 2 about the scholarship fund's distribution mechanism. He answered all 4 without needing to consult anything. I signed where indicated. Rosa notarized. Calvin's associate Marcus Webb, a younger man who had been with the firm 2 years and who appeared, in the brief interactions I'd had with him, to be learning the right things from the right person, witnessed the signing. I shook Calvin's hand. I thanked Rosa. I drove to Raleigh. Daniel was home by 2:40. He let me in and offered coffee. We sat at his kitchen table, which is a small round table near a window that gets a particular quality of afternoon light I have always found easy to sit in. I took the folder out, and I walked him through it the same way I had walked Diane through it, document by document, current valuations, structure of the trust in his name, the purpose, the access conditions, the amounts. He was quiet in the way Daniel is quiet, attentive, tracking, occasionally making a low sound that meant he was processing. At one point, he leaned forward and looked at a specific line on the trust schedule and said, "Dad, when did you?" I said, "Most of it 2003, some earlier." He said, "You never said anything." I said, "You didn't need to know yet. Now you do." He sat back, was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is this because of what Granddad said at dinner?" I said, "In part. It clarified some timing." He nodded. Then he said, "He's wrong about you. You know that." I said I knew. I said it without any heat in it, because it was simply a fact. And facts don't require heat. They just require documentation. What I did not tell Daniel, what I have not told anyone except Calvin Briggs, is that there was a 4th item I asked Calvin to prepare at that first meeting. Not a trust instrument, not a scholarship fund. A letter, 1 page, sealed, placed in my file at Calvin's office, to be opened and delivered to Raymond Collier at the time of my death. It is a precise, factual accounting of what was built, when it was built, by what means, and what it was used for. Not unkind, not triumphant, simply accurate. I do not know whether Raymond will still be alive to receive it. I do not know whether it will change anything in him, or whether anything in him is still available to be changed. But I believe in the record. My father believed in the record. A thing that was true should be documented as true, regardless of who reads it and when. 2 months after the dinner, Raymond called Diane to ask about Christmas. We went. I brought a bottle of bourbon I had been saving since 2019, a limited release from a small distillery outside Shelby, $187. A specific expression I had been holding for the right occasion. I set it on Raymond's sideboard when I came in. He looked at it and said it was a nice gesture. We had dinner. I sat at the far end of the table. The conversation moved through its usual channels. After dessert, Raymond fell asleep in the living room chair the way he sometimes does, with the television running low, and I sat across from him for a few minutes with a small glass of the bourbon on the coaster beside me, and I watched him sleep. He looked smaller than he does when he is talking. That is generally true of people. I finished the glass, set it on the coaster, put on my coat, walked out to the truck. There is a particular kind of strength that is invisible from the outside. It does not announce itself. It does not require an audience. It shows up every morning in ordinary clothes and drives a truck with 200,000 miles on it and does the work and drives home and goes to bed knowing exactly what is built and why and for whom. My father had that kind of strength. His father had it. I have tried to have it. I have not always succeeded, but I have never stopped trying. That is the only inheritance I was ever given that I did not have to earn myself. And it is the only one I have tried every single year since 2001 to pass forward in kind. 31 years of work. 3 documents signed on a Tuesday morning in November. A son sitting at a small kitchen table in Raleigh, leaning forward over a trust schedule, saying quietly, "I know, Dad. I know." That is the thing Raymond Collier looked at across his dinner table and did not see. That is the thing he has always been looking at and has never been able to measure because he does not have the instrument for it. Some inheritances are paper. Some are silence. The ones that last are neither.